Hello, everyone, and welcome to this half-hour Q&A with me, Badisha, and the writer Kiran Millwood Hargrave, in association with the Bradford Literature Festival. This follows on from Kiran's In Conversation with Jean Menzies about her YA novel, The Deathless Girls. My name's Badisha. I'm a journalist and filmmaker and sometimes actor, and we're live on YouTube for the next half hour with the best-selling novelist Kiran Millwood Hargrave. Little bit of an intro before we get into it. Her debut, The Girl of Ink and Stars, won the Waterstones Children's Book Prize 2017 and the British Book Awards Children's Book of the Year. The Island at the End of Everything was shortlisted for the Blue Peter Book Award and the Costa Children's Book Award. Her third book, The Way Past Winter, was the Blackwell's Children's Book of the Year 2018. The Deathless Girls was shortlisted for the YA Book Prize 2020 and the Foyles Book of the Year. Her first book for adults, The Marries, was subject to a 13-way auction and debuted at #1 on the Times bestseller chart. And her newest novel, A Secret of Birds and Bone, is out this autumn, so pre-order it now. We'll be taking questions from you, our viewers, as we go along, but as we warm up, let me welcome Kiran and start by asking a really simple warm-up question. Kiran, welcome to YouTube Live.
I can tell you're an actor. Your voice is so mesmerizing. I was like, you're talking. This is lovely.
I hope you're not so mesmerizing that we're lulled into sleep.
No.
I'll go right into it because I think people are here for you and they want to hear from you. So something that really struck me as I was looking through your work is you've written across poetry, plays, children's, YA, and adult literature. What for you are the salient themes, the motifs that keep on recurring?
There are a couple that I keep being drawn to, and it's very much not a deliberate decision. It's very much obviously something that my subconscious is deeply interested in exploring. And one of them is home, the idea of home. What does that mean? Is it a person? Is it a place? What does it mean to have a deep attachment to home? Is it a positive thing? I know we might see it as that because often in a story, home is like the safe endpoint of a story. But recently I've become interested in what it means when you become so obsessed with safety that you forget to live your life and you forget to experience new things and open your mind. So home is definitely one of them in a quite a complex way. And the other one I think is I'm constantly interested in decentering the traditional tropes of what it means to be a hero. So this might be through race, it might be through class, it might be through gender. It's often a combination of all those things, but I'm very much interested in othering what we might see as the normal center of the story and rather looking to the people who might usually be forced into the margins. So those are the two themes that I think unite all my books.
Kiran, I had literally gazillions of questions for you, and as I'm showing you right now, and immediately, because we're live, we have loads of questions coming up, so I'm going to throw something at you, which was also on my list. A question from Facebook. There are lots of half-told and alluded to stories in Dracula, in the Dracula myths. Are there any other perspectives or plot lines from Bram Stoker's novel that you would like to explore? I think that's one about your novel, The Deathless Girls, which really excavates all that rich mythology of Dracula. I wonder if you could say a little bit about that.
Yes, absolutely. I have a confession to make. Before
you haven't read it?
No, I have. Don't worry. Before I decided to write The Deathless Girls, I had not read Dracula. And I loved it when I did read it. And absolutely, The Deathless Girls isn't like an attack on the text. It's very much as the question, as you said, the excavation idea was really interesting to me. And originally, I was looking at Mina's story, and I really am interested, as I've already said, in breaking those traditional ideas of putting characters in boxes. And so, you know, is she just this sort of innocent waif-like figure that gets kind of tugged along by the tide, or is there a way to give her more agency? So she is certainly a character that I became very interested in, but in the end, the complete absence of a storyline for the Dark Sisters, the Brides of Dracula, that was ultimately the most inviting thing for me.
Is it also about female desire, about somehow recasting these young women as, I mean, you mentioned agency, and to me that feels like, sort of action within the text, but it's also emotional, isn't it? There's nothing wrong with being attracted by the Dracula myth. Why should we apologize for our fantasies?
Completely. I think that, and that is such a potent part of any vampire novel. It is all just a coded look at desire, and how that is still, look in the Twilight series, still a forbidden, a dangerous thing. And that's part of its allure. And I do think it's incredibly interesting to peel back all those layers, especially with in contemporary day, where women are, at least surface wise, more empowered to be sexual beings. But it's definitely interesting to peel back those layers and realize we might not have come as far as we think we have, for sure.
I have another question from that wonderful place called the internet. And so a question really about the Deathless Girls again, but I think we can open it up into all of your work. It's about your research. So the question is, did you read or watch lots of vampire stories for research? Hammer horror, Buffy, etc. What's your favorite depiction of the brides? And I would also extend that question really to all of your books. What's your starting point?
So in terms of the Deathless Girls, it was a very different process for me, because usually I'm a complete pantser, and that means that I don't plot what I'm going to do at all. I just sort of launch in by the seat of my pants, just sort of start writing and see where it takes me. But with the Deathless Girls, I had this very sort of nebulous text that I was working with that has grown into all these different genres, and grown into all these different offshoots. And Buffy is, of course, synonymous with the 90s and sort of permeated my childhood, even without being an avid watcher. And things like Charmed, and obviously the Twilight Saga more recently. And I love horror films. A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night is an extraordinary, depiction of vampirism and a take on it that, there's still so much life to be injected into vampire.
I gasped because Anna Lily Amirpour is one of my director heroes. That's why. Carry on.
Extraordinary film. It's anyone who's not seen it and likes horror or just really beautifully shot films and doesn't mind being a bit scared, because there is one particularly disturbing scene, but it is an extraordinary piece of work. And What We Do in the Shadows, of course, is one of the more humorous takes. And so I loved getting to watch all those and be like, this is research. In terms of my favorite depiction of the Dark Sisters, I think Monica Bellucci is quite hard to beat in the Bram Stoker's Dracula version. But again, it's such a reductive depiction, and it was something I was really fighting against, that idea that they just sort of slink on scene and then slink off. And in the Waterstones edition of the paperback, there is an extra chapter where I take Harker's visit from the perspective of the Brides of Dracula. And that was really interesting to do, trying to avoid what's in the text, which is them being these sort of seductive non-entities, really. So that was very interesting.
You mentioned earlier that with your other books, you're what's known technically in the industry as a pantser. What do you mean by being a pantser?
So being a pantser means you are in opposition to a planner, and it just means that you do things by the seat of your pants. So that just means that you don't really plan what you're going to do, and you just follow your nose, follow your characters. It's really a process of discovery, rather than having a plotted route. It's like having a map of a landscape, and you sort of move through it without planning where you're going to go, as opposed to having a plotted route or a sat nav telling you exactly where you're going to end up. And for me, it's the only way I can really breathe life into my stories is by ensuring I'm having as much fun discovering what's going to happen as my readers are. And I'm in awe of anyone who can plan. Like it blows my mind, because I just don't have that part of my brain. I get bored if I'm planning.
I
So
have a really beautiful question, I think possibly from an emergent writer or just a literature lover here via Twitter. How do you get in the right mood to write a book like this? Do you have a writing process or a favorite place or music that helps you get into the right sort of headspace?
that is a lovely
Is
question.
that great?
The answer is yes and no. So I have my dream writing scenario, which is working in my office where I am at the moment, but I'm not showing you because I'm moving and it's a complete, I'm just literally surrounded by boxes, and my armchair is the only thing still like standing that's not packed. So it's sitting at my desk, which just has a view of my garden. My cat's often running around out there. There are loads of birds. My husband works in a studio at the end of the garden. And it's so familiar to me. It's like interesting wallpaper. So I can sort of stare at it, and it's changeable enough that I'm not just feeling like stir crazy, but it's different. But it's the same enough that I cannot get distracted. I absolutely am so one of these people who sort of seduces myself into writing. So I have a playlist for every single book that I write. For the Mercies, it was full of exactly what you'd expect, quite gothic, quite lush, rich music. There was a lot of sort of quite dark things, like the solo album of Karen O,
Oh,
who
wow.
and Karen Elson, and just not mainly female vocalists who have these quite spare, surprising voices. Joanna Newsom is a lot on there as well, and I will sometimes light a candle, just to, they all have names like sea and north and forest, and I keep them in business for sure. So yes, that is my dream. But of course, being a writer is about turning up wherever you are, and making sure you get the words down. So I will write on trains. This in pre-lockdown. Now I can just write at my desk all the time, but I would write on trains. I'd write, in the car as my husband was driving. I'd write, just walking in my head. I'd be thinking what I'm going to write when I get home in those snatched moments. So yes and no. But I do love seducing myself to write.
Do you know the work of Anna von Hauswolf or Maria Nilsson?
Oh, Maria Nilsson I've heard of, but not
Anna von Hauswolf.
Wolf. That is a brilliant name.
This is just a total side note, but she does this glorious, surging, sort of gothic, sexy music, and you'll like it. That's all I'm going to say. You'll like it. Let's move on, because you mentioned pre and post lockdown life, and I'm wondering how, as a writer and a creative artist, you are handling lockdown. Is it just more of the same for you, or do you feel under pressure to do what so many artists feel, which is, oh my God, I have to make my magnum opus now. I have to write the script, or, rehearse and produce this Oscar-winning thing. How is it for you?
I think obviously it's extraordinary times, and for the first month I did not adjust well, even though day to day my days pretty much look the same. I'm writing, I'm with my cat and with my husband, just knowing that I couldn't go anywhere, and knowing that there were people who were suffering. And it does make you, Sarah Perry wrote an extraordinary article for The Guardian about, what's art's role in this crisis? Can it be of use? It does make you evaluate all that, and your place in the world. But to be honest, I got over that quite quickly, and I love writing. It's my way of processing, even though my books tend not to deal exactly with what I'm going through or exactly with what I think. They always do speak to the moment I'm living through, because I'm a person conscious in the world. So it has been a time for reflection, but most of all, it has continued to be a time for writing for me. I've completed a draft. I've been editing a couple of other books. I've been really busy, and those are things that I would have had to do anyway. They just would have fitted around normal life. So I've been more efficient, but I do miss the interruptions of normal life, and seeing my friends, and knowing that, you know, knowing that people are okay for the most part. So it's
What about your connection to your audience as a writer? Your next book is slated to come out in the autumn. You've had huge success, so you're not one of these authors that is to be discovered in 30 years' time. You are out there. And because you've written for a range of audiences, you have lots and lots of young fans who are exuberant and want to meet you. Do you feel that that connection is broken or impaired somewhat?
Of course, it's very hard, and to be honest, writing commitments have kept me away from things like school visits for the best part of a year now, and it's really something that I am missing. I am missing that direct feedback, that energy that you get, especially from children, especially from speaking to children. And they don't always love your books, they don't always know who you are, but they always give you something, even if it's their extraordinary ideas, their outlook on life. And I absolutely miss being in schools and having that direct connection. And my first book for adults came out in February, and at the moment, I think I was meant to be in Padua in Italy, this week, and I was going to be traveling all around Europe, and it is a different timeline. People keep saying, "Oh God, wake me up from this timeline," but I do find it interesting that actually what it's doing, rather than creating new inequalities, is it's highlighting the inequalities that have already existed. And I think, those of us that are incredibly privileged, it's just a case that we're waking up to it and we're seeing it. And I actually think that's a really positive thing, that we have more time to look and to notice and to change things and to reflect on what we can do better.
I have some very serious writing questions for you, which are going to come in one moment. But I have a very quick, not serious at all question, which has come via Twitter. Make of this what you will. Do you think you would become a vampire if you had the choice? That's Bella's dilemma, as we all know.
Absolutely not. No, it's weird. Like I do not. Yes, no.
Yeah.
One life is enough. I like being warm. I like needing to eat. I like, I know.
Having circulation, always a plus. We'll move on. There's a question from Peter Thurlow. Do you have any particular approaches you use when it comes to editing and rewriting your manuscript? So a really good technical, knotty question there.
Yeah, that is a great question. So obviously, as I've progressed, I'm really lucky to be working with editors from a very early stage, but I do still edit and rewrite at least a couple of times before my books reach my editor, just to see what do I think are the weaknesses in this novel? What can I fix without that outside opinion? And my main tip for editing is to print it out, because your eye just does react differently to paper. And also to read aloud, and you will become, unless you're bored of the sound of your own voice.
hey, now.
I would read it to myself all the time. And I do actually sometimes borrow my husband, and he reads to me too. But that's how you notice, where are you bored? Where are you skipping ahead? Where's the heat? Where is it lagging? How's the pace, all the way through? Try and become a reader of your own work and not just a writer. And that's how you really start to see the holes and the weaknesses, and what you can expand and do better. So those are my main two tips, are to print it out. I'm sorry, trees, but it really is the best, and read it aloud.
Have you ever found yourself in conflict with your editors and then later been found out that sort of they were right, that whatever you resisted persisted?
Every time. My middle grade publisher is Chicken House, and my editor there is Rachel Leishan, and she's extraordinary. And every book we have had one major disagreement, and I have not budged, and then the third time she asks me, I suddenly try it and realize she's absolutely right. So with The Girl of Ink and Stars, the whole book was in third person. She said, I really think this should be in first. I was like, I'm not writing the whole thing in first. Tried, and after the third time, she actually got Barry Cunningham, who's the director of the publishing company, to call me on a Sunday when I was at the pub and say, I really think you need to try him first. I was like, I better go home and try this in first. Tried it in first, and it was so much better. And with The Secret of Birds and Bone, again, there was one major sticking point around the villain. And I was just like, nope, she's wrong. I know this. I'm not even going to try it. And then third time I tried it, and what do you know? She was right. So yes, I'm often wrong.
There's a really interesting question here from a guy or a lady calling themselves Rogue in Terabang. I think it's a guy, but never mind. Kiran, you've been involved as a writer in residence at the Scott Polar Research Institute, which makes me wonder if you're tempted to use that backdrop to do something similar with Frankenstein. Amazing question.
Such a cool question and such a good idea. And I think Rogue in Terabang, you should do that, because that would be amazing. And I'm absolutely fascinated by the Antarctic, by the Arctic, by the extremes of our world, and by Frankenstein. What a book. I reread it recently, last year, in fact. Me and my friends tend to go through these moments where we'll reread a book and all get obsessed with it, a classic book, for a year. And it was Frankenstein, and the complexity that she manages to draw out in such a short book, I just think is extraordinary. And that you end up, in the Antarctic, and it's mad. It's a mad and brilliant book. So absolutely, that is a brilliant idea, and I feel very strongly that you should interrogate that.
Do it, Rogue.
Yeah.
Moving on from that, it's really a broader question about the richness of the Gothic, the Victorian High Gothic, which it seems to me is one of the registers of your fiction, whether or not you're writing for YA or adults or younger readers. I wondered if you could say something about what it is about the Gothic register which is so inspiring.
I love the original Gothic register. I do love that high drama, but I love even more so what came after, the Daphne du Mauriers, the Shirley Jacksons, and how they really interrogated the sexist elements of those ideas, and especially with Shirley Jackson, the classist elements, and really started to reclaim those narratives, and to pull out the richness, and rather than undermining what the Gothic stands for, these sort of isolated places, and this woman under great duress, and the set upon man, all those things are still there, but you can just do something entirely fresh and new with them. And absolutely, all my books really rely on strong settings, on this often male to female conflict, and I hadn't really thought of my writing more broadly as being Gothic, but it certainly adheres to a lot of the tropes. A lot of the weather is heightened. A lot of the situations are metaphors for other things. And so, yeah, that's a really interesting question, because I haven't actually thought of, other than the Deathless Girls, which obviously is explicitly Gothic, but it's certainly a trope, and that exists in all my work. And my next novel for YA readers will also rely very heavily on Gothic tropes.
I wondered if it's hard to reverse engineer your own writing, but making the switch from children's to YA to adult, is any of that conscious, or is it a natural evolution, or do you leave it to other people in the industry to tell you what audience of book you have written for?
That's another really interesting question. And so I definitely have always thought of myself as a storyteller first and foremost, and have always just wanted to follow my nose, follow what's interesting me, and build a career off me writing what I want to write, essentially. And I really admire writers like Margaret Atwood, like Marlon James, who have flitted so effortlessly between genres and registers, and people follow them because they're Margaret Atwood, they're Marlon James, and they know what they're doing, even if they're suddenly writing sci-fi or historical. And so it just turned out with writing for adults and writing for middle grade that those were the stories that came into my head. And it, you know, they had to be written, and it was very obvious who the appropriate audiences were. And the YA was slightly different because the Deathless Girls was a commission from my publisher Hachette. They approached me and Kit Duvall in the first instance, and she wrote an extraordinary take on Moby Dick called Becoming Dinah. And they basically, the brief was really open. It was take a male author classic and tell it from a marginalised character's perspective. So when I heard marginalised, I always think intersectionally. So I was thinking female, I was thinking woman of colour, I was thinking persecuted group, which is where I ended up with the traveller community angle, which actually had a neat time with reality, because Vlad the Impaler, who Dracula is based on, had thousands of Romany slaves, and of course they're a much maligned race throughout history. So it was a slightly more artificial process because the guidelines were in place, but I just fell in love with it. I just fell in love with writing for a YA audience, and I started off and I was quite tentative and sort of feeling my way through it, and then I read an extraordinary YA book called The Girls of Paper and Fire by Natasha McGann, and it just honestly made me rip up my manuscript and start again. I was like, this just needs to be bolder, it needs to be bigger, it needs to matter more, and that's always where my inspiration comes, is from the books I read and the stories I hear, and that book really challenged me to do better.
I wanted to ask a little bit about your audience and your readership. Of course, you are a creative artist. Your inspiration comes from within, and it's whatever you go with. But once it's out in the world and other people absorb it and then bring it back to you, I wondered if you could describe some of the reactions or some of the interpretations you had encountered when hearing other people's interpretations of your own work.
That's so interesting. And I think the main thing, and it's not a criticism per se, I think it's a curiosity that people have about my writing, is why was that person your main character? Why wasn't this person your main character? And for example, in the Deathless Girls, why was Lil your main character and not Kizzy? Because Kizzy is the more obvious choice. She's bolder, she's more beautiful, she's arguably from the outside more interesting. But I love drilling down into the best friend or the sidekick characters and really showing that everyone is the hero of their own story. You know, you are the center of your world, and you mustn't let yourself become a satellite to people like Kizzy. And this is Lil's great failing, is, you know, they're sisters, there's that unbreakable love, and that unbreakable love becomes the downfall of them both, of Lil in particular, because she is ultimately unable to break out from this shadow. But that's not the case with all my characters. You know, often my stories are about the sidekick stepping into that role, and you know, understanding that stories are just a matter of perspective. And so readers and in my first book, The Girl of Ink and Stars, it was, you know, why does this story not follow Lupe, who is my main character, is Isabella's best friend, who sort of is the instigator of the adventure. She's the one who runs off and goes missing. And it is exactly the same thing. I'm just more interested in the people who don't think they're interesting enough to hold a narrative, because they always are. Everyone has a story, and I'm really interested in shining a light on those people.
I'm wondering also if it's valuable to recast the idea of who is a hero and who is a heroine. Something I always rail against as a reader and a filmmaker is the idea that the heroine is always brave, true, strong, beautiful, apparently military grade fitness, basically a superhero in all but name. And those to me are very macho values. That's not the only way you can be strong. And I see the same thing in your treatment of your main characters, that you don't go for what is obviously seen as some definition of strength.
Absolutely. I think when you set things up in opposition, there's always going to be conflict. So if you say these are the good tropes, these are the good characteristics to have, you must be strong, you must be brave, you must be, bold and physically, adequate, or whatever that might mean. And then therefore the opposition to that, you're right, is often seen as the more feminine, which is the softer, the quieter, the gentler. And my books always seek to say, well, can't you be both? Can't you be gentle and be the hero? Isn't that a strength in itself? Look at the mess that heroes get us in all the time. And I think there is a rash of retellings that sort of do that recast heroes as the villains. And I love things like Maleficent and the Cersei retelling that Madeleine Miller did, and anything that just undermines and makes us reconsider what a hero is, what a villain is, because we undervalue traits like kindness, we undervalue empathy, and it's just not good enough. What this world needs is not more people charging around making problems. We need people we need more listeners in the world, not more voices. So that's sort of what drives a lot of my storytelling, for sure.
We're already over half an hour, but I actually don't want to close there. I have one more very simple question for you, actually, as we return to you and your writing, which is, let's say that 2020 is a bit of a write-off. You have your next novel coming out this autumn, so that's a huge point of celebration. What's next for you as an artist?
More books. So I have, after the book comes out in October, I've got another book coming out in September next year. Then I have another book in February and September. So hopefully for the next 5 years, I have at least a book out a year. So I'm just trying to follow my feet and sort of trust that I can keep doing this, because every book is a humbling lesson in discovery. And I'm just incredibly grateful that this is my job, and I'm constantly thinking of how I can do better and how I can help the industry find more amazing voices. And so I think the next, in terms of my art, just more books already plotted. But in terms of an artist, I think I very much see my future involving a lot more mentorship, a lot more activism around inclusivity. And I'm excited.
That is the perfect and very inspiring end note. Kiran Millwood Hargrave, thank you very, very much indeed. Please go and get Kiran's books. The next one is out in October that you can already pre-order. And as we've said, Kiran Millwood Hargrave is a best-selling author of many and many more to come. This has been YouTube Live, Bradford Literature Festival. Kiran Millwood Hargrave, thank you very, very much indeed.
Thank you.